Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. So, I've got something to set up for you, just so that we can get to some extremely wacky Silver Age stories. 1985. You probably know about this. DC decided to streamline their continuity with their event series, Crisis on Infinite Earths. With stories and characters going all the way back to 1935, they had 50 years of continuity and some pretty confusing parallel realities, a lot of them, and they decided to just make that a little more cohesive. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the more obscure realities. They basically codexed all of these at the time. 1985, when the maxi series Crisis on Infinite Earths came out, DC also authorized 2 indexes just listing all the characters and all the realities that they were using. It took 2 comic books of just text to explain all of that. By the way, one of those writers of the index was Mark Waid. And then that was further added to in 2005. DC put out a compendium listing all the realities. That was included with their absolute edition of Crisis. This is all just so that I can explain to you how crazy Earth 32 is. Oh, and I should point out that I'm talking about Earth 32 spelled out as this, Earth 32, because DC also has alternate realities spelled like this, Earth 32 as a number, and Earth 32 as a number with a dash between them. Those are separate realities. Technically, there's also an Earth minus 32 and an Earth 32A. And that is just the tip of the iceberg when it came to all these alternate realities. You can start to understand why DC would want to condense some of that stuff. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Earth 32, which retroactively, writers say a bunch of the crazier stories all took place in that reality. I'm going to talk to you about 5 stories that I really like from this continuity. These are going to be stories that say that Batman and Superman have extra family members, that Flash got his powers in a wildly different way, and some other crazy stuff. So, with all that set up, let's get into it. The amount of covers showing Superman pushing off Lois Lane's romantic advances have generated a whole subculture of memes. So this issue of Action Comics must obviously go one step further for DC to have decided that it takes place in a whole separate universe. The story begins with Lois Lane and Lana Lang happening to bump into each other at Metropolis's Hall of Heroes Museum. Just to be clear, not a history museum. The Hall of Heroes seems to be like a 1960s version of going to a wax museum, except instead of having bad likenesses of The Rock or something, you've got them based on fictional characters like Hercules and Samson, the Hall of Heroes. Superman is flying around spying on Lois and Lana because there's nothing better to do than act like a creep. While hiding around the corner, he hears Lois and Lana talk about how they would stop pursuing Superman if they could bump into Hercules or Samson. Their sole requirement for finding a suitable suitor seems to be that he has super strength, which I agree would be interesting, but I would also argue is not a good foundation for building a functional relationship on. I'll give this story credit for being efficient because in just one page, Superman flies into the past and grabs both Hercules and Samson. You can tell he's flying into the past because A, the caption tells us, and B, you can see the years themselves flying by Superman. I'm also a fan of how Hercules gets to ride Superman. That's worth a quarter. The story then takes some time to explain how Hercules and Samson can speak English, because Superman puts a helmet on them which is attached to a high-tech tape recorder. Time travel? Don't bother to explain it. Learning to speak English? That warrants half a page. No notes. Perfect. Superman introduces Hercules and Samson to Lois and Lana, and the strongmen quickly win them over romantically by uprooting trees for shade and punching holes in rocks. They immediately propose, and everyone gets engaged, but the Metropolis courthouse says there's a 1-week waiting period. We then get page after page of Lois and Lana being the absolute worst, making Hercules and Samson absolutely miserable. Lois has Hercules lug a house all over the property for a good spot to put it. Lana tells Samson to build a hill to give them privacy, but then doesn't like it and demands an exotic pet. Samson knocks out one of Metropolis's leopards for her. And I know this is nitpicking, a silly comic, but leopards have spots and live in either Africa or Asia, not the hills of Metropolis. The leopard also eats Samson's dinner. Lois forces Hercules to sleep outside in a tree so that her pet ostrich can use his warm hammock. This is getting confusing to me. Lana Lang crashes her car. Lois spends too much money. The comic basically tells you that women are terrible. But things still get worse because Lana and Lois get their fiancés jobs that they're bad at. Samson joins a demolition crew, but ends up tossing columns into the city and Superman has to save the day. Hercules joins the college football team as a coach, but just injures all of the players and their team mascot, a donkey. It all culminates with Lana accidentally getting gum in Samson's hair, cutting it off, and therefore removing his powers. The strongmen hate life with Lois and Lana, and Superman agrees to take them home. Lois and Lana go back to fighting over Superman, and he looks at us like he's Jim from The Office.
Please, Jim, please, please.
No one learned anything. But the next story I have has Lois Lane acting even more unhinged. In issue 59 of Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane, Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Lois Lane and Superman, gave us another story involving Lois, and she starts by popping up on Superman's feed of the Phantom Zone, where Krypton's criminals were kept. We flash back to her reporting on a science conference where a man says he's created an anti-nuclear ray that could keep a planet from exploding. Just sorry. I've got to describe this story to you, but the coincidence of like, oh, I created a ray that stops a planet from exploding. You know, like you do. Lois takes the plans and visits another scientist who just so happens to have invented a time machine. She heads over to Superman's home planet of Krypton before it blew up. She decides to share the plans with Superman's father, Jor-El, when he was a young man. However, when Lois tries to leave to go back home, the time machine is not working. She decides to herself, young Jor-El resembles Superman. If I can't marry the son, how about the father? But Jor-El is dating Lara, so Lois sabotages her by getting her hair dyed green. Lois heads to the club to dance with Jor-El, but gets tossed out of the window, and then Jor-El has time to get in his flying car and catch Lois. Jor-El scolds Lois for being so reckless. Just keep in mind, this is all written by the guy who created Lois as an ambitious reporter. Over 25 years later, she has devolved into just this weird, man-hungry machine. Lois then meets Jor-El in the park at night and makes out with him, and he assumes it's Lara because it's so dark. When the moons come out, he is disgusted by Lois's behavior, and he leaves with Lara. Then Lois witnesses the tower holding the new anti-nuclear ray disappear. Because it turns out the ray was built in Kandor City, which the villainous Brainiac shrunk before the destruction of Krypton. Fortunately, Lois's time machine just starts working again, so she gets ready to head home, but can't resist visiting baby Superman just before Krypton blows up. She begins kissing the baby like crazy, and Superman is only saved because Jor-El happens to be testing his Phantom Zone ray outside the house window, and he sends Lois to the other dimensional jail. The story ends with Superman saving Lois, but I can only imagine she's spent 20-some years trapped in there with the rest of the Kryptonian criminals. Perhaps this story was banished to Earth 32 retroactively because Lois is a straight-up villain in it, kissing babies and macking on Superman's dad. Wow, just a monster. But the next story I have flat out changes a superhero's origin. This issue of The Flash is by some of DC's best. Gardner Fox, who created the Justice Society and Justice League as a writer, and Carmine Infantino, who reinvented Flash for the Silver Age, great artist, went on to be a very successful editor for DC. But here, they introduced this strange wizard named Mopey. The story begins with Flash beating the shit out of 3 thieves by the docks. Suddenly, his suit catches on fire as he loses the ability to cancel out friction while moving at super speed. After a dunk in the harbor to put himself out, he sees a strange imp who introduces himself as Mopey, a wizard who has taken away Flash's aura because he says he gave Barry Allen his powers, but did so incorrectly. Apparently there are rules for a race of wizards, and when they grant someone superpowers, they have to do so with objects that the person winning the superpowers owns. Mopey points out that the chemicals Barry was doused in were owned by the police, so he has to remove Barry's superpowers. Barry muses on how it could be nice to not have the obligations of a superhero, but then he thinks that as the Flash he's done things like save his wife and defeat Vandal Savage with Jay Garrick. So he decides he wants to stay a superhero. Flash tells Mopey there must be some sort of a law that gives him a chance to keep his powers. The rules here become very arbitrary, as Mopey says Flash has 1 day to pay back the money the chemicals were worth, which is apparently a little over $94, and Barry must earn that money as the Flash. Flash puts out an ad and gets responses within the day by tons of people that could use his services. Flash and Mopey opt to help a plastics manufacturer who must deliver all of his stuff by the end of the day. Who's handling his distribution? Diamond Comics Distribution? Timely joke that will not age well, I'm predicting. The plastics man must deliver all of his stuff by the end of the day, so Flash runs around the country doing it. On the last delivery, his protective aura fades again and the package burns up. Inside is the diamond that the thieves at the beginning of the story were trying to smuggle. So, Flash tracks them down, beats them up again, and uses his super speed to phase through a bullet. Mopey agrees Flash has completed his test and grants him his powers permanently. Sure, this is just a fun story, but it would have retroactively changed a lot about the Flash. He didn't get his powers by chance and grow into a hero. It was something that was thrust upon him by a wizard that determined he was worthy and is a dork and can arbitrarily take his powers away if he ever decides that the bureaucracy surrounding the rules doesn't work. It would have changed a lot if they kept Mopey as some sort of recurring character. He's not as interesting as, say, Mr. Mixia's Pitalik or Batmite. Fans absolutely hated this story. It is one of the most famous retcons to then be retconned again. Just as the 60s were ending, we got a long, full-issue story that changes everything about Superboy being the last son of Krypton. It was written by Frank Robbins, who was most famous for drawing comics and comic strips, drawn by DC workhorse Bob Brown, and featured great inks by the incredible Wally Wood. One day, Superboy is in his basement in Smallville when his deep space radio picks up a recording from his late Kryptonian parents. He flies into space only to find that Jor-El and Lara are alive in suspended animation, but their capsule is covered in kryptonite radiation, preventing him from approaching. He's then blasted by nuclear weapons from a madman named Zonar, a fellow Kryptonian apparently. Superboy is saved by yet another Kryptonian, the kind Dr. Krylo. Dr. Krylo explains that he believed Jor-El's warnings that Krypton would explode and approached Jor-El with an alternative way to survive, replacing their blood with Krylo gas, a little bit of an ego there, and they would then be in suspended animation in explode-proof coffins until someday someone could revive them. Jor-El opts to stick with his plan to shoot Kal-El into space in a tiny spaceship. So, Dr. Krylo shoots Jor-El and Lara and does his gas idea on the three of them. The story then gets very convoluted, as Zonar was also a Kryptonian scientist who believed Jor-El and escaped on a spaceship, but he hates Jor-El. He finds Dr. Krylo and revives him, then basically waits for Superboy to find his parents so he can kill all three of them at once. But that's when Dr. Krylo flies in to help Superboy. Superboy and Krylo then visit Earth and get Pa Kent to put on a spacesuit so that he can tie some rope around the space coffin. Pa Kent isn't affected by kryptonite radiation. And then Superboy could fly the coffins back to Earth, open them up safely. Zonar cuts the rope, so Superboy tosses Zonar's whole spaceship and it crashes into Zonar's nuclear bombs, killing him. Dr. Krylo decides to sacrifice himself by flying to the kryptonite pod and tying the rope back together. However, once Superboy and Pa Kent safely get the coffin back to Earth, they listen to Jor-El's pre-recorded tape. Jor-El says that in the event Superboy ever finds them, to leave them be. He and Lara accidentally got doused with kryptonite radiation when doing research back on Krypton, and if they ever end up in suspended animation like Dr. Krylo suggested, when they woke up they would die painful deaths from the radiation. Thus, Superboy sadly tosses them back into space. Think about the ramifications on that one, though. It implies that there could always be a sci-fi explanation down the road to bring back Superboy's parents, because they're out there now. And that would just really change the nature of who Superman or Superboy is. You know, he's supposed to be the last member of a dead planet. Yeah, there are villains and stuff that escape, but he's supposed to be the last of his kind. And to bring back his birth parents would just be a huge change to what the character is. You know, he's an alien who has decided to adopt Earth as his home planet and integrate. And if he had his living parents, I don't know. I think it just would change a little too much about who he is. I will say, though, that the idea of other Kryptonians believing Jor-El and building their own spaceships to escape, that one I'm not as against. That's not too bad of an idea. And in fact, they sort of used that idea, Jason Aaron did, in the recent Absolute Superman stories. So that one I'm not as against. But anyway, I think having his birth parents is just too big of a change. Speaking of additional relatives, let's talk about what they did to Batman in the Silver Age. World's Finest issues 223 and 227 are two parts of a big story with Batman and Superman, as well as Deadman, who is essentially a ghost that can possess the living. The tale begins with Batman investigating the Boomerang Killer, and then talking to Deadman and telling him to let him know if he learns anything about the new mystery assassin. Technically, Batman calls him a kooky spook. Later, Superman stops the Boomerang Killer, but he doesn't get to see his face. Deadman did see the face, though, and he tracks him down. When Batman arrives to the killer's empty apartment, he sees a notepad mentioning Willowwood and decides to investigate the Willowwood Sanitarium for the Criminally Insane. The director won't give Batman a name because he actually honors patients' confidentiality, but he does admit that the patient escaped and he didn't use his real last name because it was a family secret. Deadman possesses the director and gives Batman access to the files on patients, where Batman is stunned. But then we cut to Superman stopping the Boomerang Killer, and he and Batman discuss the case at the courthouse. The superheroes continue their independent investigations, but Superman realizes that there were clues on the boomerang that Batman wasn't sharing, and he confronts Batman at a wrecking yard. There, Batman admits he discovered the identity of the killer. It is his older brother. He may still be an orphan, but he's definitely not the only member of his family. He has an older brother. It's not a fake out or a tease or anything. it says that he's got a brother. It's a big change. In a stunningly dark flashback, it turns out that Thomas Wayne Jr. was hit by a car when he was a baby, and his brain was damaged. His parents commit him to a sanitarium to care for him. Batman and Superman hide at the metal foundry and wait for Thomas to return. Deadman possesses Superman to allow Batman to confront his brother. Unfortunately, Thomas is unstable and won't talk. He knocks Batman out. Then someone operates a crane, bringing the foundry down. Superman is able to save Batman. Batman explains the crane operator is the real villain, having created a faulty bridge that killed 30 people, and he spent his years at the sanitarium brainwashing Thomas. The story ends with Deadman taking over Thomas's body and escaping. 4 months later, the story continued. Issue 227 has a much less interesting story about Batman and Superman investigating a gold smuggling ring. But Batman is really looking for new acrobats and daredevils, believing that Deadman would use Thomas's body to go back to his original profession when he was alive. Batman hides in a hot air balloon basket, somehow? But it turns out that the daredevil he's sneaking up on isn't his brother. Fortunately, Deadman, in Thomas's body, shows up in another hot air balloon and catches Batman who had been pushed out. Batman and Deadman confront the villains of the issue, but one of them gets a rifle shot off at Batman, a gunshot that is intercepted by Thomas Wayne Jr. Batman is devastated to lose his brother, and the issue ends with the distraught Batman being lectured to by Superman as to how the villains were smuggling in gold. Batman does not care. Batman with a brother. That's not too bad of an idea, but this story kind of wastes it. I mean, we're introduced to Thomas Wayne Jr., and then he's killed off. So it just ends up being this weird bit of ephemera. Like, oh yeah, Batman did have an older brother, but don't worry about it, he's dead. Doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't make the most of that story idea. These are just some of the wild examples of Earth 32. There are others where people know, they flat out know, the world knows that Hawkman and Hawkgirl are aliens. Or Superman uses special glasses to hypnotize the entire world into not knowing he's Clark Kent. Or Batman's parents dabbling with the supernatural. So the Silver Age made the most of some of these ideas, but some of them would just change too much about the core elements of the characters, so they were relegated to Earth 32. By the way, why is it called Earth 32? Well, it's not that interesting a story, but, I'll explain it. In 1964, Green Lantern visited a parallel world in issue 32 of his second series. The only difference at the time from Earth 1 was that Carol Ferris had married Green Lantern there and knew he was Hal Jordan, whereas on Earth 1, Carol only cared about Green Lantern. The compendium just chose to name it Earth 32 based on the issue number, and it probably could have been Earth 279 or Earth 59, named after one of the other issues that I've described with you today just as easily. Going down the rabbit hole of DC's many, many alternate realities is a Herculean effort. And therefore, now that I think of it, probably one that Lois Lane would make Hercules actually do. Document all these realities, Hercules. That said, I love how crazy they are, because in the Silver Age, it was just about what's the best story we can tell this month. There was not a lot of consideration for continuity, and I think that continuity can lend additional emotional weight to stories. But on the flip side, I think it can also really bog down stories. There can be just too many rules, too much history. It's just too much. So personally, I think Crisis on Infinite Earths, where they condensed everything, was a great idea. There were just too many alternate universes. The multiverse can be fun, but it can quickly get way out of control. So I just really like a lot of these stories. I hope I've introduced you to a few good ones. If you want more Silver Age goodness, I really recommend checking out Sasha over at the channel Casually Comics. She often breaks down some fantastic examples of really wild stories from that era. And I just like this because it's just so funny to me that DC actually said, no, all of these really crazy stories all take place in one world. What a crazy world that would be to live in. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back soon with another deep dive on an artist. And until then, I think you know what I'm going to tell you to do if you've been here before. But if not, just so you know, keep reading comics. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching this episode. By the way, one thing I never remember to plug is that I've got a Patreon, and that is the main way I've got to pay my bills. It's definitely at a time where YouTube revenue for like ads is god awful. So if you like this show, I would love your support. You know, I've got tiers as low as $1. At $2 and up, you get access to things like a special exclusive episode every month. And I try to do things like, when possible, upload an episode early or give you a blog behind the scenes, things like that. So just something that I would love for you to consider if you're in a place to do that. I could really benefit from that, and it would allow me to easily keep doing this show. You know, I do have a day job, and it's sometimes hard to fit everything in, but I do this mostly because I have to. I love doing this show. I love analyzing comics. I love analyzing the techniques of artists and writers. I'll always do it, but I would love your support if you feel similarly and you enjoy the show. There's also my second channel, Comic Tropes After Dark. If you want more content, I do a weekly live show and some other content over there. Some of the recorded stuff I'll do over there might be more indie comics, but I do a weekly show talking about the news. We'll have interviews. We'll do reviews of the current comics. Just quick little reviews. Anyway, appreciate you listening to me. Thanks for watching. Bye.